Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
This video you sent me just before the show is wild. We talked about Google to 1 gear ratios a couple episodes back in episode 61, and you have sent me a Google to 1 gear ratio built entirely out of Lego.
Yeah, we clearly weren't the only people who had seen that video, because this guy obviously dug through his entire collection of Lego to build one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder. I certainly thought there was probably a connection of some sort there, whether it's like a fan of his channel prompting him to make this, or whether he saw the same videos that you had passed along before, the Google to 1 gear ratios done up in metal. But doing this in plastic, it's surreal. I wouldn't have thought it was possible.
Yeah, the first thing that impressed me was the fact that, A, he had this many Lego gears that he could generate this Google to 1 gear ratio. I'm shocked that anybody outside of the factory had this many just sort of lying around and used to be able to do this. And then on top of that, the thing seems to function just fine, although the reality is that probably by the time you get a third of the way through that gear train, the early gears would probably have melted by the time any of them have moved a significant amount, sort of a third of the way through the gear train. So it's obviously entirely impractical. It's not going to last that long, but yeah, it's an impressive little machine that this guy built.
It certainly seems to be popular with the general populace as well, because within the first day that it was launched, it garnered over 1 million views.
Yeah, obviously people are fascinated by seeing these ridiculous gear trains. I don't know, maybe that's what I need to do to kickstart my YouTube channel. Although it would also help for me to actually finish a couple of more videos, because anyone out there who maybe has checked out my YouTube videos since we talked about it a couple of episodes ago now, will have noticed that I haven't actually gotten my straight line engine video up. I do have my intro video up, but not the straight line engine video. So yeah, I'm like 6.5 weeks behind on that. So yeah, I've got to get something done with that. But maybe this is what I need to make to really kickstart my channel.
You'll get there eventually. So if you were to make a Google to 1 gear ratio, how would you go about it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't like the. I understand exactly why he's doing it, but I'm not a big fan of the worm gear setup for it. I don't find it as interesting or as as visually interesting to do the worm gear setup. I think in some ways it's kind of cheating too, because you can get a really massive gear reduction using worm gears. I think it's a little more interesting to try and do it out of something else. I would probably try and do them out of steel, and I would probably try and cross out the wheels in a more interesting pattern than sort of your standard your standard patterns from watches and clocks and stuff like that. So maybe do something that's a little bit more appealing.
Yeah, there certainly are a lot of gears going on here. So you'd be making those gears for quite some time. I think it's easier to pop these out of an injection molding machine in plastic than it would be to cut all these out of steel.
Yeah, it certainly would be. Although one of the advantages of cutting them out of steel is that you can gang them up and cut a whole pile at the same time. So there are some things you can do in terms of fabrication to sort of speed it up. But yes, you're still probably talking about 6 months or whatever of cutting gears.
I was blown away by the sheer number of Lego Technics gears being used here. And I think it's a testament to the age we live in now too, that he was even able to make this. Because I think if you were to buy enough Lego sets to pull this off, unless you were a very well-to-do person, you probably very quickly go into the red. I could see spending tens of thousands of dollars on Lego sets to pull this off. But thanks to sites like Bricklink, you're able to go and just buy these gears and whatnot for pennies. And I mean, the shipping is going to obviously add up, but you don't actually have to go out and buy entire Lego sets, because even just to get those yellow racks that he used to make two of the larger gears, where he actually introduces an extra tooth in air quotes by actually leaving a slightly wider gap between two of the racks that he's attaching together. Those came in this giant bucket excavator Lego Technics set, and they were just introduced a few years ago. And that set was close to 4,000 pieces, and was quite pricey at the time that it was released.
Yeah, it was that was impressive seeing that that large yellow gear ring that he had. Although at speed, it clearly was not happy about having the missing tooth.
Mm-mm.
You could hear it complaining every time it crossed over that. So if he set it up properly, it shouldn't hit that for, I don't know, a couple million years. So hopefully it won't cause too many problems.
And a neat thing about it as well, the way that he set it up, is he actually more or less built a clock at the very beginning in order to kick off this chain sequence of gears working in tandem to build up to this ratio. And he's starting off with, I believe it was a minute hand, and then he introduces the second and then the hour hand as well. And that was neat to see too. I'm actually inspired to perhaps try and make that at some point with my son and my daughter, because I think we may have enough Technics gears to pull that off. And for a very brief time in there, I thought maybe if I were to splurge to buy those yellow racks, that I might be able to do the Google to 1 gear ratio, but the gears just keep on coming after that. And there's no chance I'm ever going to outlay that kind of cash for all those Lego gears to try and replicate this.
Yeah, even if you're just buying the gears individually, there's some serious outlay of cash there to get those gears in place. Yeah, I think one of the things, if I were going to fabricate something like this, I would certainly give it a way of indicating just how much it's moved in the time that it's been running, so that it's obvious. Because of course, one of the problems with this is that if you come back 100 years from now, you have no idea how much of the original gear train has moved since it started. So I would certainly want it to have some kind of an indicator, whether they're just simple hands that start pointing up and then start to move as they go by, something like that. I would certainly want to do something along those lines, just to make it obvious that this is in fact still alive, and that some of the later parts of the gear train have in fact begun to move.
I think in 100 years, the little minifigure there at the very end probably wouldn't even have moved enough to take up the play in the gear ratios.
Oh no, the multiple lifetimes, you would still not have taken up the backlash. And this goes back to that, the one that we talked about the last time, where the last gear was embedded in a piece of concrete. You're still talking about thousands and thousands of years before you've taken up the backlash to even start to think about the fact that piece of concrete is going to start to affect the operation of the gear train.
Mm-hmm. And a fun little fact as well, the little Ruhla clock that he drops in there to compare to the motion of the minute hand. The crown for the very first German watch to ever enter space and orbit the Earth belongs to Ruhla. So it's neat to see that little clock drop in there as well in the video.
Yeah, so if anybody else has found a Google to 1 or any kind of other crazy gear ratio, we'd be interested in seeing it. They're kind of fun to see what people are doing and see some of the innovative ways that people have done it. We'll see what other people have come up with. I'm sure that this won't be the last one that we see.
Another neat Lego video you've sent me since the lockdown began was a tensegrity structure, which seemed to kick off a whole slew of creativity within the Lego sphere on the internet, with people building all manner of tensegrity structures. This is quite a neat little build. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, this is something I've seen before, but I've never seen as a Lego build. So it was kind of nice to see the principles being shown off there. And this is something when I sent it to you, you said you had built one with your kids, right?
Yeah, we did. Since schools have closed, I've been teaching my son, because he's no longer allowed to go to school because of COVID-19, and the manner in which we've been going about our learning and explorations of the world has been to theme each week. And that's proven to be very effective in both stoking interest and creativity. And the week that I saw this video pop up, it was actually the same week that we were studying and exploring gravity together. So this was an absolutely perfect Lego build to tie in with that. So we made a tensegrity structure together of our own.
It's nice to see that you're doing that and introducing them to some weird principles that most people, even as adults, have no idea what they are. I've never played around with. Yeah, so Tamara and I have also been talking about odd things with different physical properties that don't seem to be sort of normal. And one of them is talking about rouleau triangles and rouleau tetrahedrons. There's another name for them, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. And they're objects that have a constant width, regardless of where on their circumference you look at them. And typically, we think of a wheel or a circle or a sphere as being the objects that have a constant width, regardless of where you look at them. But a rouleau triangle also does that, and it's a bit of an odd shape that people have seen, but they don't necessarily think about as being something of constant width, or that it has a sort of an odd property. And it's kind of cool because if you print or make a solid that's designed as a rouleau solid, you can actually use it as a bearing underneath a board or underneath or on a bike or something like that. And you would think that just looking at it that the board is going to go up and down and it's going to change in its height, but it won't, because the rouleau triangle has a constant width the entire way around it. So these are kind of neat little objects that if you've never seen them, again, it's sort of fun finding these things in the world that sort of defy your expectations of what they should be.
Yeah, I find them absolutely fascinating. I'm a big fan of the rouleau triangle and the various ways it's been used over the years. And this is something we've technically actually talked about on the show before, although that episode never did get published, about the screwdrivers. And Rolex actually employs a rouleau triangle in their newer screw heads that are in their 32 series of calibers, like the 3255 and the 3235. And the reason being that it allows you to apply a constant force to the screw heads. There's no deformation of the screw head that you might find in other, like, say, slotted screws and whatnot. And it's also a deterrent from people messing around where the company would rather them not be messing around. Just there's so many neat use cases for the rouleau triangles and rouleau tetrahedrons. I mean, you can even drill a square hole using a rouleau triangle, and that's one of the neater use cases that I've seen.
Yeah, the drilling the square hole is one of those neat little party tricks that I've shown people before, and it sort of blows people's minds. So that's kind of a fun one.
So have you 3D printed any rouleau tetrahedrons for you and Tamara?
I haven't gotten around to it yet, although that's something that we should probably do and play with. It's funny because you talk about using them as a driver shape for a screw head, and I hadn't even thought about doing that. But I've actually been designing a wobble brooch for broaching out things like screw heads, fastener heads in different shapes, and you can do anything you want. You can do hexagons or squares or ovals or whatever. Maybe I should risk the wrath of Rolex and maybe make some screw heads that are the same shape.
I don't know if Rolex has patented their rouleau triangle-headed screws, but I imagine they have. But perhaps you could come up with some sort of twist on it if you were to make your own, or you could come up with some other similar shape. Although it's hard to beat a rouleau triangle for its simplicity in this respect. So COVID-19 has certainly had an impact on the way we're going about our day-to-day lives and the things we've been learning about, and in my case, teaching my kids about, taking on the role of both teacher and parent and friend too when it comes to playing with Lego. But last episode, we touched on the potential impacts and ramifications of COVID-19 for the watch industry. And there was a neat article published recently on wallpaper.com interviewing a whole bunch of higher-ups within the industry just about their outlook and how this time has been for them. That shed some, I would say, some positive light on the situation in most ways. But there are darker corners of the industry that aren't taking this time quite so well.
Or you sent a article from Swiss Info on some of the watch brands that have already been affected by COVID-19 and the slowdown in the industry. And out of the 300 odd watch brands that function out of Switzerland, a dozen have already filed for bankruptcy. So this is clearly having an impact right now on on the industry, and it's just going to keep coming along, I suspect. I don't think this is going to be the last that we hear of this.
There's no hard numbers or facts within the article. This is coming from an industry insider, Olivier Müller, and he's predicting that he thinks up to 60 of the, as you said, 300 or so brands who operate from within Switzerland are likely going to be filing for bankruptcy by the time this all passes over.
And then on top of the actual brands filing for bankruptcy, Richemont has already said that they're seeing a significant drop off in their revenue, and I think they're predicting something like a 67% drop in revenue over the next couple of years. That's an unbelievable drop for an organization that size. They'll obviously need to make some significant changes to their organization in order to survive that, because a 67% drop in revenue is just not something that most organizations support.
Yeah, and that's not just a forecast. They have posted a 67% drop in profits for the year 2020 so far versus 2019. It's just staggering, really.
Absolutely, it is terrifying to see just how. And I know, speaking with friends in the jewelry industry, there's been a massive drop off in sales and revenue there. Most of them are down 30-40% on the year already, with really not a lot of prospect of things picking up between now and the end of the year. So we'll see how this plays out. I suspect that a lot of businesses are not going to survive this, even with support from the government and sort of bridge loans and whatnot that are being made available. I just don't see how most of this industry survives, which, I think if you can survive this, I think it'll be tough to sort of get through these couple of years. But if you can actually make it through these couple of years, I suspect that the landscape is going to be pretty open for in terms of competition. I can't see there being a lot of competition coming your way from existing brands.
Yeah, if the predictions hold true, and indeed, if given some of the numbers we're seeing already, the industry is more than just being decimated. It's a significant hit to business. And if I recall correctly, in one of the articles, the number of job losses that have been posted within the Swiss industry has actually been higher within the watch industry than it was all the way back in the quartz crisis.
That's terrifying to think of. Obviously the industry survived the quartz crisis, and hopefully they can do it again. The consolidation of the industries maybe is going to be of some benefit to it, just because a couple of larger conglomerations can probably survive better than a lot of smaller companies. But that's also a bit terrifying, because it means that they really won't have a lot of competition afterwards. So hopefully it's not as bad as we think it is, and the industry is able to recover a little bit.
Yeah, I would imagine that most of those statistics are including employees who are just on temporary furlough, and they'll have their jobs ready and waiting for them once the factories and manufacturers are able to ramp things up back to full steam, which is something that I imagine is going to take some time to do as well. I mean, speaking here in Canada, their government's now talking about extending their temporary wage subsidies for workers who've been affected by the COVID-19 virus. And I imagine it's probably going to be the same pretty much in every country.
I may find out a little bit sooner rather than later. I just sent off an email this morning to Eterna asking them about details of purchasing movements, because I want to be able to purchase some movements this year in order to get my first series of watches out. And I'll be curious to find out what their projections are in terms of being able to actually deliver on these movements. I'm not going to be ordering hundreds of movements or anything like that, but so it's my order will be pretty simple. But at the same time, if there's nobody in the factory making parts, if there's nobody there to assemble them, who knows how long that'll take. So I'll be curious to see what they come back with in terms of expected delivery times and when they think they'll be getting back to work.
While most establishments are temporarily closed at the moment, things haven't stopped for you over at the studio. You guys are still going full force over there, and that's in part due to the fact there's only two of you, and you have a substantial amount of space to operate within to keep a safe working distance. You alluded earlier in the episode that if you were to make a Google to 1 gear ratio, that you would make all your gears out of steel, and they have fanciful cuts and profiles that you wouldn't normally see in, say, a watch or clock or other mechanical device. And I imagine a large part of that inspiration has probably come from the fact that your plasma cutter is now up and running.
It's nice that we finally got this plasma cutter. I have to say the biggest thing that's affected us at the studio in this lockdown has been the delivery times from shipping companies. The last package of that shipment, I think it was 6 packages in the shipment, and the final one took them a month to get it from the west end of the city to us in the center of the city. So that's been our biggest delays in terms of this shutdown. But we finally got the last package last week, and we got the plasma cutter assembled over a couple of days. And let me tell you, I am thoroughly impressed with what a plasma cutter can do. In my case, with the gears, I would probably, I probably wouldn't try and cut them on the plasma cutter. It's not really a delicate instrument in terms of making watch gears, but in terms of being able to quickly fabricate parts for around the shop, it is unbelievable how effective it is at being able to turn around designs and actually be able to get them in solid steel. We've been shocked by just how effective it is.
I wasn't really imagining cutting watch gears with a plasma cutter. I don't see that happening. I was thinking more slightly larger than clock size, and that you would just do the profiling of the spokes on the plasma cutter, and then stack all your gears together and rip the teeth out on the lathe.
Yeah, I'm still not sure that I would do that. I think unless they were quite large. I mean, maybe if this is a large installation piece to go in the front window or something like that, I could see that. But even then, it's not ideal for some of that. Certainly not as precise as I'd like to see for what that is. But yeah, it's an amazing machine in terms of what it can do and how quickly it can cut out parts. The other day, we picked up a saw for cutting steel faster, some of our tube steel faster. It looks very much like a miter saw. And I happen to have an old miter saw stand that had a wood saw on it. And now that's on a workbench that's mounted to the wall. So it's this miter saw stand is unused. So we thought, hey, let's put this new saw onto there. But things didn't quite line up properly, and it wasn't really designed to mount to it like the wood miter saw did. And so we thought, well, let's just make a plate for an interface between the two. And honestly, it took me longer to find fasteners to attach this saw to the plate than it did for Rich to model the plate and then cut it out on the plasma cutter. It only took him a few minutes to do that, and it was unbelievable just how effective it was. And it was accurate and perfect exactly the first time. And we didn't have to go back and make any changes to it. So it's unbelievable how effective this thing is, and the fact that it can tear through 3/16 thick steel, and it doesn't really think about it. Like, it's doing that at a couple 100 inches a minute is unbelievable.
That's incredible. I've not done anything that fast with a machine from idea to finished product. I don't think ever. I mean, the closest would be like cardboard prototypes on a laser cutter, but even then, that's wild.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm in the same boat. I haven't normally when I'm sitting there, it takes me quite a while to sit there and model it, and then okay, now I'm going to mill it, and the milling time is significant, or whatever it is, the printing time is significant. This thing is just like get her done. It's incredible how fast it can tear through your design. So. We're currently in the process of designing a bunch of other things that we can print on it easily. A welding table is high on my list of things to make because we desperately need a welding table in the studio. So I suspect this week that will be one of the tables that I end up working on this week is trying to get that welding table done.
I've never used a plasma cutter. Is the bed on the cutter a consumable item, or what prevents the plasma cutter from tearing through the surface that you're actually cutting on?
That's a good question. So maybe for people who don't know what a plasma cutter is, it uses a very high current that is pushed out of the cutter head by a swirling compressed air stream. So there's actually a nozzle that's in there that spins the metal, or sorry, spins the compressed air. And so you're putting the compressed air out at, let's say, 75 psi, something like that, 80 psi, and it's forcing this the spiraling airstream through the high current, and it forces out this plasma stream basically, which is sort of the same kind of temperature as the surface of the sun, like it's thousands and thousands of degrees, and it just melts any metal that's underneath it. But at the same time, it also melts any metal that's underneath it for several inches. And obviously that's problematic when it comes to trying to put this on top of something. So the way that it's held is that there's vertical slats that you put your material onto, and those vertical slats do get cut and chewed up. But because they're vertical and you're just running the cutter torch through it, and I guess the kerf on the cutter is maybe a millimeter or two in diameter. It's not that large. Because of that, your slats survive for quite a while. And then the slats are also on a water bed. So you've got a tank that's underneath it that has a couple of inches of water. And one of the things that ends up happening is this does generate a fair bit of steam, just because you've got this plasma stream hitting the water and vaporizing it as well. So it's a combination of those slats, which are consumable, and then the water, which of course is easily replaceable because it is getting steamed off as you're using it. So yeah, it's not the cleanest of processes. You certainly wouldn't want to put this in your watchmaking studio because the gases and the steam and everything that's coming off of it is not particularly pleasant. But it's pretty amazing how fast this thing will just vaporize metal underneath it.
So did you cut out the metal frame under your watchmaker's bench on the plasma cutter as well?
No, that one I actually made out of steel tube. So I just purchased some 2-inch square steel tube, and I was able to to just drill and cut the the parts using sort of regular hand tools, just because that was the most appropriate way of doing it. It was the fastest way of doing it, and then welded up the steel frame using just using a MIG welder. So that was a little bit faster to do that way. But we are thinking about making the legs for our new kitchen island out of it. We've got a nice piece of live edge walnut that we're making the kitchen island from, and we need some legs for it. And so we're currently playing with some design ideas, and we'll end up cutting those out of steel on the plasma cutter for sure, because it'll be nice and fast to be able to do it from there.
It certainly sounds like a great tool to have in your arsenal.
Yeah, it really is. It's we've talked in the past about force multipliers, and where things like CNC machines and 3D printers and whatnot are able to allow a single person to quickly fabricate parts that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. And this is certainly a thing that can do that, especially once you're familiar with welding and you can weld those things together. As I said, I'm in the process of designing this welding table, and it's just using a tab and slot design so that I can quickly, sort of slot everything together and then weld it in place. And this makes it trivial to do. It's just so fast to be able to cut out those slots and cut the appropriate tabs so that you can slot the whole thing together, and then it just make sure that everything is square as you're welding it, and you're good to go. So it's rather impressive. I should also say that while we've been talking about the CNC version of this plasma cutter, we do also have a handheld one as well. And even just having that handheld plasma cutter is incredibly useful. Being able to quickly part off an object, or cut out a little corner that you need for a part. Something, let's say you're going to weld a plate to the bottom of a leg, and you need to, you've got some scrap metal sitting around, you weld it on, and then you need to trim it off. it's so fast to be able to just take the plasma cutter, use that torch to just slice off the excess instead of trying to use a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder or something like that, which is slower and messier and whatnot. It just seconds. It's sort of the closest thing you can imagine to having an actual lightsaber. It's obviously it doesn't extend out as far as a lightsaber does, but it's exactly that kind of power when you're working on it. These torches are rated up to, I think, a 1/2 inch of steel, and it's amazing watching it just tear through that 1/2 inch steel.
Why settle for one when you can have two?
Well, sometimes it's handy to have both going, right? You can.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Also means that we don't have to disconnect the one that's on the CNC machine to be able to then use it by hand. It's amazing when you start setting things up so that you don't have to tear down setups to be able to then go off and do other work. It's amazing how much faster you can get to work. As you alluded to, I've been working on this new watchmaker's bench, so I've been making a walnut top for that. And between having a jointer and a drum sander and thickness planer and everything readily available and all at hand and set up all the time, I was able to build that tabletop in a couple of days. The last one that I did like that took me weeks, just because you'd have to I had to set up outside with my table saw, cut everything, then set up a workbench outside to glue it all up and hope that it doesn't rain while I'm doing all the glue up and everything. And it took me weeks to put together my last bench top, and this one I was able to get it all up and running in a couple of days.
Yeah, I absolutely understand and agree with the logic behind it, and having that sort of system set up and in place, it reduces the friction in so many ways, and you're just able to move that much more quickly and get to a final product that much more quickly.
Years ago, Adam Savage referred to it on one of the tested videos as basically a hot glue gun for steel, and it really is. And it's worth getting a decent one. I've had cheap MIG welders in the past, and they've been incredibly frustrating to deal with. But once you get a decent MIG welder, and it's just so fast to be able to knock things together. I knocked together a couple of benches for some of my tools. I've got grinders and stuff like that, like tool and cutter grinders, and a few other things in the shop, which desperately needed some benches. And I could not knock together these benches in wood as fast as I was able to knock them together in steel. It was just very quick cuts on the saw, weld them together, grind some of the welds down where necessary, and away you go. It was incredible what you could do in a couple of hours with this technology. So if you're setting up a shop and you're looking at what sorts of things you should be putting in there, even if you're not planning on doing a lot of metal work, once you have some of these tools, it's amazing how fast you can start fabricating benches for yourself, parts for things that you're trying to do, whether they might be fixture parts or whatever. It's pretty amazing how quickly you can take advantage of these things to extend what you're able to do in the shop and expand the sort of the tooling that you have available to you in the shop.
Yeah, MIG welder is another tool that I can't say I've ever used myself, but I could see the parallel there to being like a hot glue gun.
Well, maybe once we get out of lockdown, we'll have to have you over to show you the wonders of hot metal.
It'll be an excuse for you to whip out a quick video too. You can just show me failing miserably at my very first weld.
Yeah, quick video. I'm not sure those two things go together.
Come on, you should be able to humiliate me in under a minute.
It's the quick video part that's difficult to do. The humiliation part, I'm sure, is something we can arrange, but the whipping together a quick video is not something that I seem to be capable of these days.
Hopefully it'll be like water skiing and I get up on my first try.
Honestly, I was shocked when you get a decent MIG welder, and one of the things when I say decent MIG welder, I mean something that has a digital panel on it that you can easily set up the welder for the particular material that you're trying to work on. It's amazing how all of a sudden it just flows and it just magically works properly for you. There's nothing more frustrating than a poorly configured welder, and it's I mean, unless you're willfully ignoring the setup, it's very difficult to configure this welder wrong, which makes things very, very easy when it comes to getting everything right and then getting passable results from it.
Well, I certainly look forward to getting out of lockdown and finally being able to head over to the studio and see all the transformations that have taken place there for you guys. And then an atelier that was neat to get a peek inside an area I haven't ever and probably won't ever again have a chance to get a peek inside of was seeing the artwork that sits behind Kari Voutilainen when he's at his desk.
Yeah, his home office is entertaining, and I guess from the story that he told at the end of last week's Time for a Pint, it sounds like the previous owner of the house was a painter and had decided to paint the wall in that room with a Tintin mural, and Kari decided to leave it up, which was great, and so he had this great background behind him in last week's Time for a Pint.
It was certainly a hit in the comments there.
Yeah, and then on top of that, the watches that Kari brought along were just fabulous. It was nice to see some different things coming out of it, and stuff that obviously somebody like Kari is going to have access to, but most people are just not going to be able to get access to some of the watches that he has.
Yeah, it was really neat to see those pieces that he brought along. He had a very early Sarpaneva watch. It had a very three-dimensional dial to it. I really enjoyed the look of that. The hands are no match for the later Sarpaneva watches, but the case and the crown and the dial all speak very heavily of the Sarpaneva design language. You can tell that those traits were there very early on within the birth of his brand.
Yeah, certainly that dial was the second I saw it, I recognized the design language, and it was really nice to see. I'm intrigued by the dial design and the technique. I say technique. I don't even know how he designed that dial. I have to go back and take a look at it again. But the three dimensionality of that dial was fabulous. It was a very, very bold design, very very strong, and it was really nice to see. The hands were not as strongly designed, I don't think, as the rest of the watch, and certainly the newer ones are much nicer. But then the case itself, I mean, that case was incredible. I mean, that thing was got to be able to withstand a nuclear blast. It was incredible how durable that case is.
To be fair to Sarpaneva, the hands weren't designed at all, so that's why they don't speak to his strong suits later on when it comes to the hands. They're just hands that were more than likely just purchased from a material house or a supplier. But yeah, that case, oh my goodness, that's certainly not a case that's going to pass the cuff test. One aspect of the case that I found quite interesting is the way that it's actually fit together. There's no case bag on it. The movements and the dial and everything are placed in through the front, but the shape of the case and everything else, you really question how is this all put together? How is that back of the case just one contiguous surface and there's no visible seam on the sides? And it turns out that the bezel portion of the watch, which has a nice high polish on it, contrasting with the brushed finish on the actual case portion itself, the means by which those two components are affixed together is actually behind the strap. So between the lugs there, you'd actually have to take the strap off, and there's screws there that are holding the case and the bezel together. So that was a neat insight from Voutilainen as well into the construction of that particular piece.
Yeah, it was interesting to see and interesting to talk about how Kari talked about it, and in terms of how it's assembled. I'm not sure that it's going to sort of light the watch world on fire in terms of its manufacturing techniques, but it's certainly effective the way that it was built, and as you say, there's no way that it's going to pass the cuff test. That's definitely a watch to wear when you're out on a weekend with a short sleeve T-shirt on or something, because it's any decent shirt's going to get destroyed by that thing.
Yeah, it's pieces like this that break from the norm that help to push the industry forward, whether or not this particular piece and everything that it's about gets adopted in any manner directly. It's this sort of experimentation that is what catalyzes change and progress.
Absolutely.
And fellow Canadian James Thompson was in on the call as well. And he's known as the Black Badger on Instagram and Twitter and elsewhere. He's dropping some hints that he would love to get together with Voti Lennon to loom up one of his pieces someday.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's Kari's style, but it would certainly be an interesting collaboration between the two if it happened.
I think if Kari were to take him up on it, I would love to see him just do something completely different and off brand from what he would normally do. And just something very futuristic on the outside, but then when you flip it over and see that and the backside and the movement, to have that impeccable level of finish that Voti Lennon is known for, just jump out at you. I think that'd be a real under the radar sort of timepiece. Well, not that any of James Thompson's timepieces are under the radar.
No, subtle and under the radar is not really how you describe James and his work. And James had some great stories as well. I mean, the story about his watch was good, and it was obviously a fairly personal story. It wasn't an exceptional watch from from a collection point of view, but it was nice to hear the story behind that. But he also had some few other interesting stories, and like the time that he was working on nuclear submarines in Australia. It was rather entertaining. So it's certainly worthwhile going back and watching that, if only for some of the entertaining stories that come out of these guys.
Mm-hmm. And Chris Mann brought along a lovely old Seiko as well, which is in incredible condition given the age of it. And he had somehow managed to get that through a gentleman who imports camera gear, of all things.
Yeah, as Chris says, he likes to sort of troll at the bottom end of eBay, and every once in a while you get a gem out of it, and that's certainly what this was. I'm a fan of some of those Seikos from the 60s and 70s, and certainly the design language and style of those the 60s and 70s Seiko watches is just fabulous. The dials in particular are just unbelievable, and it was nice to see that particular piece. And as you said, the condition on it is remarkable. I've seen and handled a bunch of watches from that era, and they're often not in nearly that good condition, just because they were everyday wear watches, and so they were abused and banged up against the sides of subway cars and scratched, and it's they had a life, and they were obviously well used, but this watch was clearly not used anywhere near that much. So it was nice to see a case that was that sharp and that clean, as well as the dial.
And generally speaking, each guest on Time for a Pint brings just one watch to show off, but Kari bent the rules a little bit, and he did bring a second watch to complement the Sarpaneva that he brought. And this was quite a special piece as well. It was the number 0 prototype, more or less, of a perpetual calendar from Urban Jorgensen. I noticed in the chat there, as the conversation was going on, that you quite liked the layout of the day and the date windows on this piece.
Yeah, that was one of the intriguing things. I'm sure that I've come across this watch before. I'm sure that it's come, that it's sort of come through my feed. But one of the problems when you see so many watches coming across your feed, and especially when you're looking at them on a smaller screen, if they're, let's say they're maybe a mediocre Instagram photo or whatever, it's often difficult to notice some of these nice little details, the nice touches that are in these designs. And in this case, the day and month windows are off at 9 and 3, just like you would expect them to be. They've moved them just above that center line, so that you can still see the markers at 9 and 3, but you don't get but the actual day and month and whatnot indicators are above that. Those little windows are above it, and it's nice because you're still getting them horizontal, so you're still able to read them like you normally would. So it's not as if they're so like some of these designs where they're at let's say 4:30, where they're off on an angle, they're off on a 45 degree. These are still horizontal, but because they're north of that, that line, that center line, it sort of elevates the visual feel, the visual weight of that dial, and lifts it up a little bit from the bottom of the watch, and it's a really nice touch, and I can imagine that it probably wouldn't be too difficult to do, because I expect the wheels are probably the same underneath. They've just printed them so that they're so they read properly in that slightly elevated window position. So it's certainly possible to do with just about any of these watches, but it's not something that you see a lot of people do, and it's one of those nice little details, one of those nice little design touches that you see that makes it stand out. And as we've talked about in the past, neither of us are really particularly big fan of date windows on watches. I find them far too busy most of the time, and because they're sort of all the same, I find they tend not to really be that interesting. And this is nice because you get that date window in there, and you get that extra little detail that makes it stand out a little bit and changes the feel of that dial balance. And that's something that's tough to find on watches. You don't get a lot of that, the sort of little changes that actually improve the watch. A lot of the changes that you see, they're sort of mediocre and questionable as to whether they're actually improving the quality of the design or not. But this was definitely a nice touch.
If I accidentally said day and date back there, that was completely unintentional. I blame Rolex for that one. Their day date. I would really love to see under the dial of this piece and see exactly how the wheels were laid out, and whether they were printed in an offset manner or whether they just happened to be set there because that's where they are running axially, and whether the positioning of the day of the week and the month are actually in line with the center of rotation of the discs, or whether they have been printed offset, as you mentioned. And the back of this watch too, I would have loved to see the movements.
This is one of those watches I'd love to see the movement under the dial for sure. But when I sort of did a little bit of rough sketching the other day about, sort of thinking about this and thinking about how I would accomplish it if I was just using a stock movement. And I think you could probably get away with it. Assuming that the dials that those, the day and the month they're running on are large enough. And I'm pretty sure that they're going to be big enough just because of the size of the print and what you're putting on there. I'm pretty sure that you could get away with it without having the those discs sort of axially above that sort of east-west line in the movement. So I suspect you probably could get away with it. Now, whether that's what they actually did here or not, who knows? We'd have to see under the dial to be able to know that. But I'm pretty sure you could get away with it on this watch if you were careful with it. And it would certainly help even if you just saw the discs turning over from day or month, then that would also probably give you a pretty good indication of what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. And I'd have to go back and listen to the recording, but this was all going on live as we were catching it. But I believe he mentioned it was based on an FPGA caliber, so we could probably just do a little digging and actually find the caliber itself. But what really delights me about Jurgensen's work, and Kari has actually done some work for them in the past, which is why he was able to get this piece, is just the level of finish on the movements, and both on the backside that the client or the owner of the watch is sometimes able to see through a display back, but also on the dial side too, the parts of the watch that the owner would never see. Just the level of detail and finish and care that the watchmakers pour into those pieces.
Yeah, I suspect the fact that it's based on a standard caliber means that this is probably a design choice that they've made, and they could have just as easily put it at the sort of the standard positions, but I'm really glad they didn't.
And often what you'll see too with a lot of perpetual calendars is that these windows will be placed closer to the center of the dial, so they're almost right next to each other. But this particular positioning, I find, gives the dial quite a bit more levity and lightness. It doesn't feel crowded in the center there.
Yeah, especially considering this, I think he said this is a 38 millimeter watch, and it doesn't feel like that. I find that a lot of 38 millimeter watches with this much going on tend to feel quite cramped, and I find this one doesn't. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with these windows and just what they've managed to do with them. If they were to do what most people tend to do with these these windows, I think it would probably feel really really claustrophobic.
Now, one area of the movements where Kari did get into quite a bit of depth and detail was with the manufacturing of the moon phase disc. And I imagine you must have found this quite interesting to listen along to, given that one of your first timepieces is very likely to feature a moon phase complication.
I've got to go back and listen to that a little bit more because I missed a couple of the details that he was talking about. But it sounds like this is a gold disc that they're using, and that lends to some of the color and the sort of texture of the dial. So I need to go back and listen to that section again. But I am curious to hear what he had to say about it, because as you say, this first watch that I'm working on is a moon phase. And while I'll be doing a custom printed dial for mine so that it's unique to the standard Eterna movements that I'm using, I'm always curious to see what other people are doing with their dials, their sort of under dials like this. And I don't think I'm going to change up what I plan on doing for these watches. But who knows, for some of my next ones, I certainly have an idea or two for maybe a very limited series watch that has a moon phase that's a bit different. And this might lead to a couple of choices that I may change up with that. So yeah, it'll. This is one of those things where I really wish that I could get my hands on this watch and sort of take it apart and look at it in more detail. But that's obviously not something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, from my understanding of the way that Kari described it, the disc isn't entirely gold. The disc for the moon is fully gold, and as are all the stars in it. It is actually a steel disc that they carved out some recesses into and then hammered gold into. They polished it all as one piece and then heat treated the disc over top of a watchmaker's lamp in a tray of brass filings, as you do. And the steel took on that nice bluish hue that you can get with heat treatment, while the gold, being a noble material, was not impacted in any way during that heating process.
And interestingly, that's not dissimilar to a design idea that I've already got for one of my future moon phase discs. So I'll have to go back and listen to exactly what Kari said about that. That's encouraging because it, as I said, it sort of leads me to believe that the direction I was going with one of my next pieces is probably going to be the right way to go with that.
So if you haven't checked out Time for Pints virtual get-togethers yet, I'd certainly encourage you to do so, whether you're able to tune in live in person or catch the recordings that are posted to YouTube later.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.